Hello and welcome to the race edition of this week's Race Weekend data analysis for the Spanish Grand Prix, the episode in which I'll be compiling all of the lap time data from the Grand Prix, creating all sorts of positions charts, lap time charts and things like that, and comparing all of the teammates together. Each of them are timestamped down in the description below, so you can skip to whichever team you'd like me to talk about. I'll be spending about 2 or 3 minutes on each team, so this video should be between 20 to 25 minutes, maybe 30, depends on how much I blabber on. We'll also be giving a general overview of the entire Grand Prix, just a quick rundown, and then also a look at the whole Grand Prix lap chart, look at the different phases, and also the positions chart as well. So without further ado, we will jump on into the race data for the Spanish Grand Prix, and just quickly recap the events of yesterday. It was Lewis Hamilton who came away with a 98th career victory, 16 seconds clear from Max Verstappen after pulling out a strategy masterclass. Valtteri Bottas makes it his 16th Ham-Ver-Bot podium. Leclerc comes home P4 for Ferrari and Perez P5. Ricciardo puts in a stellar performance for McLaren, with Sainz filling a McLaren sandwich, Ocon P9 and Gasly claiming the final point in 10th. But taking a look at this Grand Prix positions chart, we can see, not a lot. It's traditional Spain, to be honest. No great positional changes other than the pit stop phases, so anywhere between laps 20 and 26 in that midfield. And then we've got an Alfa Romeo of Kimi Räikkönen going slightly further back, as well as Alonso on lap number 60, a nice steep increase for him. Other than that, there isn't really much else. It's very like the Abu Dhabi ones that we see as well. Lots of nice straight lines and not a lot of positional changes. But taking a look now at the overview of the lap charts, this is the zoomed out version. We'll be taking a look at a zoomed in version just a little bit. We can see the safety car between laps 8 and where the safety car came in on lap 11, and then everybody's pit stops, including some of the late ones from people like Max Verstappen, and also I believe Valtteri Bottas took a late pit stop, I think, off the top of my head. And we can see each individual phase of the Grand Prix here. However, taking a zoomed in look, we can see so very clearly, the absolute pace advantage of Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton in this Grand Prix, especially in the first 22 laps. Their pace advantage is absolutely ludicrous. We can also crystal clear see each of the different bands of racing for about the first 50 or so laps. So just by these blue arrows here, we can divide up the first section before the first safety car into 3 bands of racing. We have Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton a second faster than anybody else, out front and comfortably out front. We then have the midfield battle, which is led mostly by Charles Leclerc and Valtteri Bottas, and then at the top blue arrow, we then have the back runners. These are the Williams and the 2 Haas cars. However, post safety car and until we get to the first round of pit stops, it actually divides into 4. Once again, we have Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton out front, about half a second a lap to a second a lap faster than the next 2 cars by the second green arrow up. These 2 are Valtteri Bottas and Charles Leclerc, and they themselves are about half a second to a second clear of the second midfield pack, which is probably headed by the 2 McLarens, and then we have the 2 cars at the back, which are both Haases. Then we get a jumble of mess in the middle, which is all of the pit stops, and then by these 4 yellow arrows, again, we can see a nice distinction of 4 bands of racing. At the very top, we've got the 2 Haas cars and a Williams. Then in the middle, top middle, we then have a second band. Then in the bottom middle, we've got a third band. This is the 2 McLarens and Charles Leclerc. And then the bottom band, joining Hamilton and Verstappen, is actually Valtteri Bottas. Then we've just got all manners of spaghetti wobble and rubbish in the next section of racing, and then slightly difficult to see by these 4 red arrows, we can once again see 4 bands of racing. This is the clearest evidence of bands of racing that I have ever seen in all of my time looking at Grand Prix data. But with all of that out of the way, we will now be delving on into the teammate comparisons. We are going in 2020 championship order, and once again, everything is timestamped in the description down below, so you can skip to whichever team you would like me to talk about. We are beginning, of course, with Mercedes. Now, I'm just going to take a little bit of time to explain these graphs. So we begin with the percentage pace difference in the bottom right. This takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, divides them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, and then orders them from small or largest down to small smallest. Anything above 100 is where Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and then anything below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going faster. And then we can divide this graph down the middle, and we can then say that for 30.3% of the Grand Prix, Valtteri Bottas was the faster of the two Mercedes, and then for 69.7% of the Grand Prix, it was Lewis Hamilton. And then we can also work out each driver's average competitive lap times. And for Lewis Hamilton, this was a 122.197, and for Valtteri Bottas, this was about 3, maybe 4 tenths slower of a 122.577. Now, the average competitive lap times averages out all of the laps, excluding lap number 1, excluding any safety cars, excluding any VSCs, or any mistakes/pit stops as well. Hence the name average competitive lap time. But now turning our attention to the laps chart in the top left, by this blue arrow on the grey dotted line is the fastest lap time set by the 2020 car, by the highest finishing 2020 car. This was of course Lewis Hamilton, so this grey dotted line is Lewis Hamilton's lap times from 2020, compared of course to their 2021 lap times for Lewis Hamilton in the black line and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise line. And once again, working out the average competitive lap times for the dotted line, it was a 122.669, actually 5 tenths slower than Lewis Hamilton of 2021. Now, this is mainly because of the reprofiled turn 10. This is the first time that we have seen the cars go faster at a circuit, but bear in mind, turn 10 is different, and you carry so much more speed into that section of corners. So that's mainly where this time difference has come from, but turning our attention now and breaking down these charts, we can see by these two green arrows that the first portion of the race before the safety car, Hamilton was about a second a lap, sometimes 1.5 seconds per lap faster than Valtteri Bottas, extending the gap to just over 10 seconds when the safety car came out by lap 8, but of course Bottas was stuck behind a Ferrari, having lost out on the start. Then after the safety car period, by these two dark green arrows, Hamilton is still clearly the faster of the two Mercedes, but it's no longer about a second/1.5 seconds. It's probably in the region of about 7 tenths per lap. So it's raising the gap from after a safety car restart to almost 10 seconds, until we get a Valtteri Bottas pit stop here by the red arrow, which raises the gap all the way to just about 30 seconds. Bottas then takes immediate advantage of his fresh tyres, and he himself goes about a second a lap faster than Hamilton, until Hamilton himself comes in for his pit stop, which decreases the gap to about 3 seconds. They're then fairly even for the next portion of racing, up until Hamilton comes in for his second stop, where Bottas actually gets back in front, and then of course we had Mr. Bottas being a little bit of a knob and not really obeying the team orders that were given to him, until Hamilton managed to pass him on lap 52. And then Bottas then comes in for his pit stop just to the right of the dark grey arrow on the laps chart, and then afterwards they're fairly even, and the gap stays at around 25/30 seconds. If anything, Bottas is a little bit on the inconsistent side. I'm not quite sure what happened on lap number 60, where he had a 1:24 lap time, whereas he was averaging around a 1:21, so he had about a 3-second mistake there, and I'm not entirely sure what that was for. Actually, maybe that was to recharge the batteries to go for his fast lap, as immediately after he did go for his fastest lap, which was a 1:19.6. And so with Mercedes all done and dusted, we then apply all of this same data down to Red Bull. And splitting the percentage pace difference graph down the middle, we can say that for 19.7% of the Grand Prix, Sergio Perez was the faster of the two Red Bulls, and for 80.3% it was Max Verstappen. And then working out each driver's average competitive lap times, it was a 122.3 for Max Verstappen. However, it was a 123.1 for Sergio Perez. That is a difference of almost 8 tenths. Now, bear in mind, Sergio Perez was in traffic for a lot of this time, whereas Max Verstappen had a lot of clean air and can put in sensible lap times, but that is a hefty gap. That is double the gap between Hamilton and Bottas. And bear in mind, Bottas was also stuck in traffic for a long period of the Grand Prix, stuck behind Leclerc and also battling with other cars as well. But then turning our attention to the laps chart for Red Bull and taking a look at their grey dotted line and their average competitive lap time of 2020, which was a 123.07, about 7 tenths faster they were this year than they were in 2020. But then turning our attention as well to some of the details in the laps chart by these two green arrows, much like we saw with the Mercedes, Max Verstappen is going about a second and a half faster than Sergio Perez, but again, Perez is stuck in traffic, raising the gap to about 20 seconds. They then, after the safety car, Max Verstappen actually maintains this 1 to 2 second advantage, whereas actually Valtteri Bottas managed to close it to Lewis Hamilton. Max Verstappen managed to extend it, raising the gap once again to just over 20 seconds. Verstappen then comes in for his pit stop first, which decreases the gap to about 2 seconds, and then we've got a Sergio Perez pit stop immediately after that, which increases the gap to about 30 seconds. Then post-pit stop, it's Verstappen who once again takes advantage of his fresh tyres and is about a second a lap faster in this section of racing, from about lap 30 to around lap 46, when his tyres start to degrade and Lewis Hamilton actually comes in for his pit stop around this time. So Verstappen increased the gap from lap 28 after Sergio Perez's pit stop to about 50 seconds. But then by this dark grey arrow here, Sergio Perez starts to go a little bit quicker, and at one point he was a second a lap faster, but only for a couple of laps. And then I'm not entirely sure what happened. Both Red Bulls came in for fresh tyres, and then they just went for fastest laps right at the very end. And so from Red Bull, we take a look at the Papaya McLaren team, and splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, for the first time, Daniel Ricciardo was the faster of the two McLarens for 78.5% of the Grand Prix, compared to Norris's 21.5%. It was definitely not a happy race for Lando Norris. And then looking at their average competitive lap times for the two drivers, it was a 1:23.469 for Daniel Ricciardo, and then about half a second, just over half a second down, it was a 1:24 flat for Lando Norris. And then comparing these lap times to their average competitive lap time for 2020, that was a 1:24.3. So actually they've gone significantly quicker. They've gone almost 9/10 quicker than they did in 2020. But now looking at some of the details of the McLaren's lap chart, once again by this light green arrow, we can see in the first stage of the race, just before the first safety car, it's Daniel Ricciardo that is about half a second, this time faster than his teammate, so he raises the gap from lap 1 to about 10 seconds by the first safety car at lap 8. Then post-safety car, Daniel Ricciardo extends his advantage just a little bit, up to about 8 seconds, as he's again about half a second a lap faster till about lap 20, until we get to the pit stop phase of McLaren, where it is Lando Norris in the orange who comes in first, which increases the gap to just above 30 seconds, and then immediately after, Daniel Ricciardo comes in, decreasing the gap once again to 10 seconds. However, post-pit stop, Daniel Ricciardo is monster quick. He is a second a lap faster for about 5 or 6 laps, raising the gap from 10 seconds post pit stop to about 20 seconds around lap 36, where Lando Norris actually starts to go a little bit quicker, just here between these two orange lines. And then from the point where Lando Norris starts to go quicker, there is another pit stop for both drivers, and then just all manner of inconsistencies happen right at the very end, which constitutes to this odd, bizarre-looking section of my gaps chart. The nice little trough where Lando Norris takes over the lead of the McLaren pair for just a little moment is due to the pit stops, and then the sort of wibbly-wobbly gap just to the left of the far right sort of orangey arrow on the gaps chart is mainly because of all of the inconsistencies between the two drivers. And with that, we leave McLaren and take a look at Aston Martin, and straight away you can see some massive inconsistencies from about lap 26 till the very end of the Grand Prix. Both drivers were just all over the place, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can say that for 53.8% of the Grand Prix, it was Lance Stroll that was the faster of the Aston Martins, and for 46.2%, it was Sebastian Vettel. Very interestingly, this is the same percentage difference for the Portuguese Grand Prix. Exactly the same. And the average competitive lap times for both drivers was a 1:23.748 for Lance Stroll and a 1:23.79 for Sebastian Vettel, just half a tenth in it across the entire Grand Prix. However, looking at the laps chart here by the dotted grey line and averaging out their 2020 lap pace, it was a 1:23.8, so they have only gone 2 tenths faster, compared to McLaren's almost second a lap faster. However, what I said about the inconsistencies from about lap 24 to 26 onwards till the end of the Grand Prix doesn't really apply to the first section. By these light green arrows, they're actually even. The gap stays between about a second and 2 seconds for almost 20 laps. It isn't until the first pit stops here, by this red arrow, where Sebastian Vettel comes in first, peaking the gap to about 22 seconds, and then immediately after Lance Stroll comes in, which decreases the gap, it just sort of goes to pot. And they are extremely inconsistent, sometimes doing a 1 minute 25, the lap later they do a sub 1 minute 24, then sometimes they're in the 125s again. I have no idea why they were so inconsistent. And like I said, the inconsistencies are highlighted here by the dark green arrow where the gap just fluctuates all over the place, anywhere between 3 and 5 seconds for about 15 to 16 laps. Then by the light grey arrows just here, they come in for their second round of pit stops, once again Sebastian Vettel coming in before Lance Stroll, which is interesting as Sebastian was never the lead racing point, yet he got the first pit stop, which again spikes the gap to about 22 seconds, but Stroll comes in immediately after, decreasing the gap to under 5. And then by the yellow arrows just here, I don't know what happened whatsoever. Take your pick, it could have been absolutely anything. On some occasions, Vettel is above the 1 minute 25s. On the next lap, he's almost in the 1 minute 22s. And then the next lap, he's back in the 1 minute 24s. Next lap, 1 minute 23s. I have no idea what was going on. And exactly the same for Lance Stroll. It could have been blue flags, but for that long of the Grand Prix, from lap 42 onwards till the end, I'm really not sure, and that absolutely sent the gaps chart into haywire, going from anywhere to about 4 seconds to about 6 seconds for the remainder of the Grand Prix. And then from the inconsistencies of Aston Martin, we take a look at Alpine. And as always, we split the percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 76.9% of the Grand Prix, Esteban Ocon was the faster of the two Alpines, and for 23.1% it was Fernando Alonso, a race that Alonso really didn't enjoy. He tried the one stop, and it just did not work. And the average competitive lap times for both drivers was a 124.4 for Esteban Ocon, but interestingly only a tenth and a half down for Fernando Alonso, a 124.5, but it was such a miserable Grand Prix to the point where he finished 40 seconds down on Esteban Ocon by the time the checkered flag fell. But taking a look by this blue arrow and the grey dotted line at Alpine's 2020 average competitive lap time when they were Renault, it was a 124.5. So again, they've only gained about a tenth, not even a tenth. And when you see teams like McLaren that are gaining almost a second, you can see how it massively affects teams like these. But similarly to the McLarens, we can see here that Esteban Ocon is about half a second-ish, maybe 2 or 3 tenths a lap faster than Fernando Alonso for a large portion of the Grand Prix, especially the opening phase and post-safety car until the first round of pit stops, and he raises the gap to about 6 or 7 seconds. We then get the first round of pit stops with Fernando Alonso coming in first, raising the gap to about 26 seconds, and then Esteban Ocon coming in immediately after, and then between these two yellow arrows, they're sort of even. Esteban Ocon is a little bit on the quicker side, which is shown here by the gap increasing from 5 seconds post-pit stop to about 15 seconds by lap 48. And then excluding Fernando Alonso's last pit stop, we can see by this dark green arrow here that they had an enormous pace drop off. Both cars tried the one stop, and by lap 50/52 they had zero pace whatsoever. Alonso had to come back in and Ocon stayed it out, but he was in the high 1 minute 26s by the end of the Grand Prix, where everybody else is in the 1 minute 23s. The one stop did not work. And then heading from Alpine, we take a look at the Scarlet Ferrari team. And again, splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can say that for 30.3% of the Grand Prix, Sainz was the faster car. And then for 69.7%, it was Charles Leclerc. And the average competitive lap times for both drivers was a 123.163 for Mr. Leclerc, and about, or actually exactly, a tenth down was a 123.263 for Carlos Sainz. So actually exceptionally close between the two Ferrari men. Sainz said post-race that he was not happy with his P7 and he wished for a little bit more, but honestly, to be on average a tenth down on Leclerc, that's not bad. But looking at Ferrari's grey dotted line for their average 2020 pace, it was a 1 minute 23.9, so they have gained about 8 tenths, almost a second, much like McLaren, which is how they were able to stick it to P4 with Mr. Charles Leclerc. They have gained a significant amount of lap time from their 2020 pace. But then turning our attention to further details in the laps chart, post-safety car, Charles Leclerc was about a second per lap consistently from when the safety car came in on lap 10 to the first round of pit stops for Carlos Sainz around lap 22, which rose the gap all the way to about 15 seconds. Carlos Sainz came in for his pit stop first, which rose the gap to about 36 seconds, and then a couple of laps after, it was Charles Leclerc's turn to come in, and the gap decreased to about 12 seconds once again, where they were exceptionally even until the second round of pit stops for the Ferrari men. The gap stayed at around this 12 to 15 second range, up until it is Sainz's turn to come in for his second stop, raising the gap to just above 40 seconds, and then Leclerc comes in for his second stop, decreasing the gap back down to 15, where again, they're a little bit on the inconsistent side. And then from Ferrari, we take a look at Alfa Tauri, and unfortunately there is always one team where a car doesn't make it a very long way, so there isn't too much data that we can take a look at, but we can split the percentage pace difference down the middle and say that for 33.3% of the laps that they were running together, Yuki Tsunoda was the faster car, and then for 66.7% of the laps, it was Pierre Gasly. But bear in mind, they only ran together for 6 laps. And then again, I can work out their average competitive lap times, which was a 124.9 for Yuki Tsunoda and a 123.8 for Pierre Gasly, but again, Tsunoda only did 6 laps on heavy fuel, on slightly worn tyres, so it's not really fair to compare these average competitive lap times. However, looking at the gaps chart to their grey dotted line, we can compare their average 2020 competitive lap times to Pierre Gasly, and their 2020 pace was an average lap time of 124.437, which again is about a 6/10 gain to 2021. And then we take a look at Alfa Romeo, the battle between Giovinazzi and Kimi Räikkönen, splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle. For 43.1%, it was Giovinazzi who was the faster car, and for 56.9%, it was Kimi Räikkönen, with the average competitive lap times for both drivers being a 124.4 for Kimi Räikkönen and actually a 1 minute 24.3 for Giovinazzi. Which seems interesting that even though Giovinazzi did not finish ahead of Kimi Räikkönen, he was actually the faster car by about 1.5 per lap. But taking a look at the average competitive lap time of the grey dotted line of their 2020 pace, that was a 124.1. So again, they've actually lost time on their 2020 pace by about 0.2 a lap. And I think this is the first instance where a team has actually lost pace on their 2020 pace around Barcelona. However, taking a look at some of the details of the laps chart, we can see the absolutely bodged pit stop for Giovinazzi, which rose the gap all the way to 50 seconds, but thankfully it was during the safety car period, so he was able to catch up this gap, and it didn't really hinder him too much. Then post-safety car, we have this section between the two red arrows where they are dead even. The gap stays around 8 seconds from lap 12 to lap 26. Then just here by the yellow arrows, I'm not entirely sure what happened, whether they came in for a second stop. I believe they did for both cars. There was also a couple of mistakes from Giovinazzi and also Kimi Räikkönen, which rose the gap to about 20 seconds. And then finally, between these two dark green arrows, there's a couple of sloppy laps where they're probably being blue flagged and having to let cars past, but again, they are exceptionally even, with the gap again staying around 20 seconds. And then penultimately, we take a look at Haas, and once again, they are extremely inconsistent throughout the entire Grand Prix. Both drivers are very inconsistent. I don't know whether that's just the car being absolutely crap, or there is something else that is deeper afoot, but both cars, both drivers, are equally as inconsistent as each other. But splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can say that for 25% of the Grand Prix, Nikita Mazepin was the faster Haas car, and for 75%, it was Mick Schumacher. And taking a look at the average competitive lap times for both drivers, it was a 124.8 for Mick Schumacher, compared to a 125.4 for Nikita Mazepin. That's about a 6/10 difference. But taking a look at the grey dotted line and their average competitive pace for 2020, that was a 125.1, so they've gained about 3/10. Again, that's in the lower sort of region. And in the first portion of the Grand Prix by this red arrow just after the safety car, although both cars are extremely inconsistent, they are both inconsistent together, so the gap stays at around 5 seconds for about 20 laps, up until the first stage of pit stops where it is Mazepin who comes in first, just before Schumacher. The gap raises in Schumacher's favour to about 30 seconds, and then comes back down to their lovely 5-second gap. Schumacher then takes advantage of his fresh tyre compound by going about half a second to a second a lap faster than Nikita Mazepin. This was Schumacher's most consistent phase, although it wasn't particularly consistent. They then come in for a second round of pit stops just here by the 2 green arrows, with Nikita Mazepin coming in about 10 laps earlier than Mick Schumacher right at the very end. But just to highlight the pure inconsistencies between these 2 orange arrows, they're doing some 1 minute 27s, sometimes 1 minute 25s, then the next lap it's in the 1 minute 26s, next lap it's in the 1 minute 22s, next lap it's in the 1 minute 26s again. It is so very inconsistent, and the gaps chart just goes all over the place, to the point where at the flag, Nikita is 50 seconds back. And then finally, for the race edition of today's race weekend data analysis for the Spanish Grand Prix, we take a look at Williams. And splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can say that for 44.6% of the Grand Prix, Nicholas Latifi was the faster of the 2 Williams, and for 55.4% it was George Russell. With the average competitive lap times for both drivers being a 124.9 for George Russell, and actually 4/10 faster was Nicholas Latifi on a 124.5. So again, even though Latifi finished behind, he had the faster lap times. And looking at Williams' 2020 average competitive lap time by the grey dotted line, that was a 125 flat. So they've gained about half a second per lap in the Spanish Grand Prix. That is slap bang in the middle of the field. And for the first portion of this Grand Prix here by the red arrows, both drivers were uber consistent and so very close to each other. There was literally nothing to separate them for the first 24 laps of this Grand Prix, and the gap was about 4 seconds for the majority of this race. Until they come in for their first round of pit stops here by the yellow arrows, where they slightly bodged up a double stack pit stop trying to emulate their heroes Mercedes, but ultimately it didn't really cost them too much time. Then post pit stop, they are once again absolutely glued together in terms of lap time, with the gap staying at around 6 to 7 seconds. Then Nicholas Latifi comes in for his second pit stop here by the grey arrows, which raises the gap to 40 seconds, and then immediately after this, as George Russell stays out on a 1 stop, Latifi is about 2 seconds, sometimes 3 seconds a lap faster than George Russell, which closes the gap from 40 seconds down to just below 10 at the checkered flag. And that is where the difference in average competitive lap times comes from. It is the last 15 laps of this Grand Prix. And there we go, there is all of the race data concluded for the Spanish Grand Prix. If you have enjoyed today's slightly longer episode than usual, then please let me know in the comments below. And if there are any thoughts or queries at all about any of this data, then please let me know. I am very happy to have a little chat with you guys. But that's all I've got for you today. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.